Christ's return. When we are frustrated and distracted by people who are evil and cruel, we are to focus on our eternal hope in Jesus Christ. Here's Gene to explain this principle.
They were living in an environment that was totally controlled by the wealthy. They had no rights. In some cases, no way to meet their physical needs. They were being persecuted, mistreated. I can't identify with that. I'm glad. But that's what these people were facing. And so James encouraged them in 4 ways in this paragraph. Number 1, be patient. Realizing that when Christ returned, he would deliver them from their earthly circumstances. Believe me, the second coming of Christ took on meaning to these people, because to them, that was their only way out. In James chapter 5, verse 7 and 8, therefore, brothers, be patient until the Lord's coming, and strengthen your hearts because the Lord's coming is near. In other words, they were looking forward to the coming of Jesus Christ. He hasn't come for 2,000 years, but he will come. And God wants us to live in the light of the fact that he could come anytime. So the second coming of Christ became very meaningful to these people. And then he encouraged them to not allow their circumstances to cause tension among each other as believers. One of the things that can really happen under these conditions is that even believers then can get into tension with each other, especially when there are needs that are not being met. That can flow into the relationships within the church, and James dealt with that. And so he says, brothers, do not complain about one another so that you will not be judged. Look, the judge stands at the door. In other words, don't allow these wicked people to cause you to get sucked into the same problems and destroy the love and the relationships that you can have with each other. So he was exhorting them. And then thirdly, he encouraged them to take comfort by remembering the Old Testament prophets who suffered from those who rejected the message of the truth. In other words, he says, you're not alone. This is nothing new. He says, brothers, take the prophets who spoke in the Lord's name as an example of suffering and patience. And of course, when we studied the book of Hebrews, went through Hebrews chapter 11, all of these individuals that are mentioned, or at least most of them, suffered, were persecuted. And they didn't lose their faith. They kept looking to Jesus, the author and the finisher of their faith. And so he said, take courage. You're not the first ones to have faced this. And then finally, number 4, he gives the 4th word of encouragement. He says, continue to be honest in the midst of a culture permeated with lying and cheating and manipulative behavior. And boy, that's a tough one. And I believe that's what he meant when he said, now, above all, my brothers, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or with any oath. Your yes must be yes, your no must be no, so you won't fall under judgment. In other words, be honest. Don't say yes when you mean no, no when you mean yes, because that's the world system. Be honest. Don't allow yourself to be pressed into that mold. And so the question, which is kind of a difficult one to relate to. Why is it difficult for most of us who live in free societies to identify with the struggles of many first-century Christians, as well as those who live in repressive societies today? I mean, there are a lot of people today, if they were listening to what I'm sharing, they would identify with all of this. They would identify with it because they're living in that kind of culture. They're disenfranchised. They have no rights. They're abused as Christians, literally murdered, literally taken advantage of. Romans 8:18. It's really hard to identify with this. For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is going to be revealed to us. Well, that's certainly a wonderful message in terms of suffering. And people who are ill and people who have life-threatening diseases and so forth are suffering, and life for the future becomes more of a reality in terms of what lies ahead of them. But here, Paul's talking about this kind of stuff that James was talking about. Peter, and we're going to look at Peter next, his first epistle. And he was dealing with the suffering and the persecution that probably took place during the time of Nero, where crosses were surrounding the the city of Rome with crucified believers and set on fire. Those were difficult times. And so he writes to these people who are victims of some of this horrible evil that permeated the Roman Empire. He says, "You rejoice in this, though now for a short time you have had to be distressed by various trials, so that the genuineness of your faith, more valuable than gold which perishes, though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor at the revelation of Jesus Christ." I don't know about you, but that's hard to identify with. You know, it's really interesting in our culture, isn't it? I'm being persecuted. I'm suffering because my third car won't start this morning. I'm complaining today because I have to replace my water heater. That, after all, is 20 years old. It's outlasted the warranty by 10 years. I'm really having a tough time today because I bought a new pool sweep and he's not running right, which is a personal testimony. I just bought one and I'm kind of upset with the fact that I took it in for evaluation. They haven't even called me back, and they said they were going to call me back 3 days ago. You get the point. I mean, isn't it rather ironic, the things that we complain about in relationships, some of the things we've read about here in the Scriptures? We don't even understand it. I know I don't, and so shame on me. It's a great message, I think, that comes to all of us. On the other hand, there are people who can identify with this. And how do we keep from, well, how can we, let me state it positively, how can we apply this principle? Well, one thing for sure is that we've got to maintain perspective, and particularly as it relates to the second coming of Jesus Christ. And we can't allow ourselves to be pressed in to the world system, even in this culture and this society which has been so good to us in so many ways.